Welcome to this, our first in a series of conversations that we are initiating with Professor Raymond Suttner, the Living History series. The title is self-explanatory, but the intent is much deeper in that we are hoping that Prof. Suttner's engagement with us will really cement this organically growing culture of ukubuza inyathi kwabaphambili, this intergenerational conversation that is forming a bedrock for us at Nelson Mandela University. I am the head of department for the newly established Department of History and Political Studies. So welcome, I see all the colleagues, I see CANRAD colleagues. Please mute your microphones and please keep your videos off as far as possible. I would now like to welcome Professor Andre Kiet, the acting Deputy Vice Chancellor for Engagement and Transformation, to give an official welcome for us today. Thank you, Prof. Kiet.
Thanks, Nomalanga. Welcome, Raymond. It's good to see you again. The CANRAD Living History series, in partnership with the Department of History and Political Studies at Mandela University, presents a series of talks, lectures, and engagements with visiting lecturer and researcher Professor Raymond Suttner through the methodology of intergenerational dialogue and critical public conversations. The Living History series provides a public platform to those who have lived through significant historical moments to share critical reflections and analyses on key aspects of their lives and times. The series seeks to foster intergenerational conversation as a critical element of knowledge making, memory making, and community archiving. It goes beyond the formal academic curriculum by engaging history through those who have lived it. It positions Ingoko Nabadala, conversations with elders, as a critical form of African pedagogy. In the series, we seek to challenge our students, the university community, and general public to engage robustly with the multiple ways in which history is transmitted and conveyed through times, in oral and written form, through contestation and dialogue, in official as well as unofficial archives. This approach reminds us that history is continuously made by new generations through time as old memories fade and new memories are formed. Given the shifting and contested nature of memory, and this is the crux of the series, it is critical for universities to provide students with multiple tools and platforms to enable them to grapple with questions of history in an ethical, rigorous, and credible manner. For this series, we have Prof. Mkhize as the series moderator, and we also have a veritable feast of young intellectuals who will be respondents in this program. For the first one of today on Nelson Mandela's Masculinities, we have Karma Nofefe from Krishet. And then for tomorrow, for the next one on Africanization, African identities and emancipation in contemporary South Africa, we have Pedro Mzileni, who's an NMU lecturer in sociology. The session on Chief Albert Lutuli's leadership significance for us today will be responded to by Samkele and Gadi. And the installment on popular democracy in the 21st century will have Masibuko Jaga in conversation with Raymond. And the fifth one on the ANC and history and in government today will be responded to by Asimahle Kwala from our university. Now, as you would know that this particular series, Raymond, Nomalanga, Alan, and others, fits into the university's strategic imperative of revitalizing the humanities. It's a key area of the way in which the university is trying to reimagine itself, but also build an intellectual culture that's worthy of a university of high repute. So this forms part of a bigger much bigger social and academic project within the university. And Raymond, of course, we are grateful to you for availing yourself to be part of this big project within which this particular series will play a pivotal role. So a warm welcome to you, Raymond, and of course, a warm welcome to everybody else in this space. And thank you so much for making the time to attend and get our intellectual culture vibrant in so many exciting ways. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Kiet. Now, in the program, I've been asked to introduce Prof. Satna, and just note that his bio is available to you in PDF format. But I will introduce him as the way that I have come to know Raymond, which is, you know, I come from a home of struggle veterans. So, you know, people who have given up their lives, their youth to the anti-apartheid struggle are people who are always close to my heart, whether they are people I know from my home or whether I just know them by name, people like Raymond that we know by name, because they carry with them the spirit that led South Africa through some very dark times. Raymond, I have a deep amount of respect for you, and it is a privilege that we have a university named after Nelson Mandela, and you are here to talk to us and talk to these young people who are going to challenge you and tell you your ideas are not intelligent and box with you, and also tell you that they love your ideas as well, and that you avail yourself for this kind of open engagement and challenge and inqoko is very important to us. It is the spirit that you have carried throughout your life as a struggle activist and as somebody who has also been in politics after 1994, a principled person who walked away from the party of your youth, the South African Communist Party, and someone who retains a sense of dignity about also speaking back when you have to speak, but also sharing when you have to share. So with that, I want to welcome you with very warm heart and open hands. And I would like to encourage everybody to receive Raymond and this platform in that spirit, not in this detached academic spirit, but in the spirit that we are raised with in South Africa. So welcome, Raymond, and I invite you to present your paper, and I invite people to listen and take notes, and feel free. Raymond has indicated that he believes in debate.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Mr. DVC, Alanson, head of CANRAD, Nomalanga, head of history and politics, and staff, students, and the general public. I'm very happy to be here. I feel, as you say, it is important to engage with a university that is named after Nelson Mandela. But I'm not saying that in the spirit of romanticism, because I know you will hold me in check. And I've also had to be very careful. I'm aware of the fact that many of the young people today think that Nelson Mandela was a sellout and a whole lot of other things. And I don't want to myself bend the stick too far and romanticize and see no faults and errors in what Mandela did. In fact, since writing this paper, I have come to see that there's something that I didn't deal with adequately, which I will refer to when I get to that point. What I think is important is we are dealing with Mandela in relation to masculinities. And masculinities in South Africa is a very important phenomenon. We have lots of violence in this country, and a lot of that violence is attributed to men, or most of it is attributed to men. And I would relate this to the models of manhood that are commended to us as boys and as men. I myself was at a school where my greatest ambition was to be a rough, tough man. But unfortunately, I didn't quite make the grade. But it was my hope to be a Springbok rugby player rather than an academic. And I was not cut out for that. But that was the ethos, one of the elements of this rough toughness which white South Africans had. And I think in the Eastern Cape, people are crazy about rugby as well, so Africans as well, so that it's not just a white thing. But I think the consideration of masculinity is important for the type of society that we build, a society which is not just aggressive, but cares about people. Now, what I'm going to be arguing in this paper is that Mandela is not considered very often in the context of gender and in the context of masculinities, but he himself was very preoccupied with what it meant to be a man, and what he did at various times, he said, is what a man should be doing, where he regretted he was not there to be what he thought a man should be in relation to children, spouses, and things like that. So he's very concerned about it, but also what is important and encouraging for us as men or boys or people who study men and boys is that Mandela was not one man throughout his life. He continued to change through various phases. So I'm going to be dealing with the unfolding of his life, which has ruptures as well as continuities. Some of what he was when he was very young, some of what he was when he was a young man, the rough, tough Mandela, the boxer, came back in his later life. De Klerk knows that very well when Mandela got very angry with him in public at Codesa. So I want to examine Mandela in relation to the type of country that we are and the type of human being that he was and became over time. And as I say, we are not dealing with a person who was one thing throughout his life. But in his early days, Mandela grew up like most boys do, playing with boys, and the things that boys did were mainly rough games. Those who did not hang around with boys were regarded as sissies, and he didn't want that. He did stick fights and a lot of war games, and he heard about these things from his father and from elders about the wars that people had been involved in. And that was the notion of what it was to be a man, to be able to fight. A muscular strength as demonstrated in the stick fighting. But even at that stage, you could see that the muscularity was mediated by the need not to humiliate the person who you had defeated. Once you had seen they were defeated, you had to preserve their honor, according to Mandela. Now, all these notions were part of the wider society in which Mandela grew up, not only in his initial home, but when he was adopted by the regent of the Tembu people, Yongintaba Dalindyebo. And when he went to this home, his mother said to him, just before she left him, she said, "Brace up." And it's not clear what she meant, but she may have meant be strong like a man, because it's not only men who constitute men as men, but also mothers who sometimes constitute men, boys, already before they become men, as being en route to becoming a man. Now, at the court of the regent, Jungenthaber, he observed the proceedings, and in these proceedings of the councils, he heard again about the wars of resistance, the wars when African people were conquered. But a very important event which Mandela deals with in his period of guardianship is that of initiation. Now, it's very important that we understand that although he deals with circumcision, initiation is much more than circumcision. Circumcision is a medical procedure, but what we are concerned about is what are the notions of masculinity that are communicated to a man, a boy who's becoming a man. Now, Mandela describes, and you can see this in the process of circumcision, when you have your foreskin cut off by the Ingribi, the circumcision doctor, you are supposed to shout loudly, immediately, Ndian daughter, I am a man. But the pain was so great, Mandela confides to his audience, to his readers, pain was so great that he was unable to say that for quite long. And he felt, in a sense, that his transition, the key element, one of the key elements of his transition to manhood was thwarted by his cowardice, as he saw it then, his inability to act like a man should, bear pain in a way that you do not reveal it to the people. I think it's very important that Mandela tells that story about himself, that he, in a sense, gives others, given that he's writing this in his 70s, he gives us permission to also sometimes be physically not so courageous as other people. Now, there's another thing that happened in the course of this big proceeding. There were celebrations afterwards, and during the celebrations, families gathered there, and the main speaker of the day, Chief Meleqeli, points to the ambiguity of manifesting adulthood, and specifically manhood, in conditions of subjugation. He says to them, really, we are slaves in our own country. We are tenants on our own soil. This thing of you being, this ritual of manhood is an empty, illusory promise while you are unfree. Now, Mandela at that time was not the militant that he later became, and he was angry. He didn't like what the chief said. He thought this is not correct. Mandela himself was living a cloistered life. He didn't have a lot of contact with whites and with segregation and apartheid. And he found this statement of the chief to be discordant, out of line with the celebratory nature of the process that he'd been going through. But he says, without exactly understanding why, his words soon began to work on me. He had sown a seed, and though I let that seed lie dormant for a long season, it eventually began to grow. Later, he says, I realized that the ignorant man that day was not the chief, but myself. Now, what I think is important is the notion of being treated as boys or girls, and that's the language of apartheid, and still the language to some extent in South Africa today, is part of the metaphor for liberation. The metaphor for liberation used is often a very masculinist language, recovering our virility and becoming a real man. And in some senses, this is not quite the same as acting out patriarchy in relation to women. It is rebelling against being not being an adult in this country of yours. Now, the perpetual childhood then was what the chief was referring to. And Mandela came to, he was haunted by this. When he went to the Witwatersrand and he got involved in the Defiance campaign, and he was the volunteer in chief, you can see in his words in Long Walk to Freedom that he remains haunted by this idea that he was not a real man. Even though Mandela was a boxer and he was a powerful human being, it is only really in the Defiance campaign when he says that the enemy felt my blows. Let me just find this exactly. I had been engaged in a just cause and had the strength to fight for it and win. The campaign freed me from any lingering sense of doubt or inferiority I might still have felt. It liberated me from the feeling of being overwhelmed by the power and seeming invincibility of the white man. And his institutions. But now the white man had felt the power of my punches, and I could walk upright like a man and look everyone in the eye with the dignity that comes from not having succumbed to oppression and fear. I had come of age as a freedom fighter. So Mandela's emerging masculinity starts to converge with his seeing himself as a free human being who needs to liberate his country from apartheid. In this period, he was gradually emerging as a heroic figure in the 1950s, a freedom fighter willing to devote everything to the struggle. This converges with him simultaneously being a boxer. There is a man that I quote who was a waiter at this time, and people ask him, what's going on in the struggle? And he said, the man, Diale, says, Mandela's going to be in court. And the people say in this gathering there, he'll beat him up, he'll beat him up. So Mandela's roughness and toughness as a boxer was part of the imagery associated with him before he went to jail. Now, what I want to relate this to is the public and the private in Mandela's relationships. Now, in this section, I want to refer to the fact that I think I've not done justice to something. But what I mentioned here is that Mandela, in patriarchy, men, and especially heroic men, occupy the public space, and women are consigned to the home. It's part of a broader mythology about man, the hunter goes away, or man goes on adventures, and the wife is waiting to welcome him home. Now, all of his wives were in the public sphere, and in that sense, they were not expected to simply be homemakers. And what I also refer to there is Mandela was very involved in domestic work in his first marriage, getting things for the house, doing household chores, looking after the children, and so forth. And Adelaide Tambo says that Evelyn, his first wife, was the envy of very many women because he would go and buy all these things for the house, etc., etc. Now, what I've done wrong here is that it is mentioned in Anthony Sampson's biography and a few others that at one stage Evelyn brought a charge of assault against Mandela, and this charge was withdrawn. Now, I took that as being the end of the matter, and I actually criticized Sisonke Nsimang because she wrote an article where, I've got to mention it in a footnote there, she wrote an article where she refers to Mandela, if what was alleged was true, he actually did grow later and become a more gentle person, etc., etc. And I said, look, if it's alleged and the allegation is withdrawn, you know, we're dealing with something that is not admitted to have happened. Now, what I found, however, is there's an article in African Studies late last year by Paul Landau. And Paul Landau went to the treason trial archives, and in one of the unmarked boxes, he just stumbled by chance on a deposition by Mandela where he makes the statement where he more or less admits to having, or he does admit to having assaulted Evelyn. On the one occasion, hitting in the face, another occasion, she says he more or less holds her by the throat, sort of strangles her while she has a poke. Now, bearing in mind Mandela's overwhelming strength, there is no doubt that we can't treat these things, even if a charge was withdrawn, we can't treat these things as allegations that were withdrawn. He happens to have admitted himself. It's a signed statement. I've not seen it because it's not digitized and it's in a box in Pretoria, etc., etc. But I must assume that this would not have been written by a scholar of some integrity had it not been what he saw. So I want to mention that because it's very important, even if you're someone like myself who has admiration for Mandela, you must admit to your audience that there is this evidence which you have not presented adequately to the public, and it's something that they are entitled to know and to take into account. Even if Mandela grew and changed and became gentle, more gentle and all of this, this is part of the skeletons in his cupboard from an earlier phase. So I want to mention that as something which I ought to have treated in a different way from that which I do in the paper. Now, the Mandela who went to jail as this angry, tough man who was regarded as a heroic figure, but was very aggressive, quite apart from what he did with Evelyn. He was in any case an aggressive person, very often hauled over the coals by the ANC leadership for doing things of his own accord. Now, the Mandela of the 1950s had been finding his feet in a quite different world from that in which he was brought up by the regent. And in some ways, a number of his aspects of his background come together in his being a founding figure of MK. On the one hand, the warrior tradition in which he was brought up, but also this attraction for boxing. It is said that to become a boxer, even a very good amateur boxer, requires a monastic type of discipline. Now, in some ways, that was a preparation for Mandela becoming a soldier, even if he was not a soldier for very long. Now, when Mandela was sent to jail, in fact, before he was sent to jail, he again uses the discourse of masculinity to describe his thoughts about the possibility of getting a death penalty. And he says, if that happens, I will face it like a man. Again, that discourse, I think we've got to distinguish two types of discourse. Manhood, which is used as a shorthand in the language of, in liberation discourse, to equate with dignity and freedom, and manhood as in violent masculinities. I don't think they're quite the same, although there's an overlap between them. Now, Mandela then drew on his conception of needing to act like a man and face the possibility of the death penalty. Anyway, he didn't have the death penalty, and he went to jail. And a lot of the people who studied Mandela believe that the period in prison was very important in forming Mandela, and he himself speaks of maturing. And I think we have to recognize that it's not Mandela himself alone who ensured that he became a different person when he re-emerged from prison. I think it was, we have to acknowledge from the earliest days of Mandela's adulthood is the influence of Walter Sithole. Without Walter Sithole, there would never have been a Nelson Mandela that we came to know. And Mandela is always cautioned by Sithole before he is about to do something that may be which may be impetuous or overly aggressive. Although Sithole did admire the qualities of Mandela, the obstinacy, when they order all the prisoners to march quickly, Mandela walked very slowly, and he said they didn't understand how obstinate Madiba is, that he would walk so slowly, they just gave up on that. His period in prison was a very important period in terms of becoming a rounded, less sectarian person. He was always asking all the prisoners from all the different backgrounds what their beliefs were, what their programs were, and he had like appointments throughout the day. This coexisted again with a sort of firmness. When he played chess, he took so long to make a move that people just gave up in the end. So there were qualities in Mandela that, in a sense, were part of the process that led to him seeking peace. When he was in jail, he came to the conclusion that the apartheid regime and the forces of liberation were not able, neither of them were able to have a complete victory. There'd been ungovernability, there'd been popular power, but the liberation forces were not able to overthrow or defeat the SADF. But on the side of the regime, they were not able to secure sustainable governability. This is a condition which Antonio Gramsci refers to as a reciprocal siege. Now, in that situation, it is possible to move away from perpetual conflict. And Mandela reached out. Now, in doing this, Mandela speaks about how some of what he learned as a young boy prepared him for collective discipline and all this sort of thing. Now, a lot of Mandela's life is in fact breaking with the collective, doing things on his own, none more so than when he started talking to the regime. Now, Mandela is very straight about it. He says, I didn't consult because I would have been stopped. Now, that's a complete break with collective decision-making. Even though at the earliest opportunity, he did try to reach Lusaka and to get approval of the regime. Of the ANC. The ANC is now the regime today in 2020. But we must remember, even if Mandela was breaking ranks, he had nothing to gain from it. People would call him an individualist, call him ambitious and all of this, and they have done so. So Mandela took this opportunity, and I think it has been vindicated by time, no matter what the flaws that we experience in South Africa today. Now, a lot of Mandela's masculinities and a lot of Mandela's leadership is dependent on imagery. I referred to the imagery of the boxer, the tough young man, which was read into his politics by many people. But when Mandela came out, it was a different time. It was a time of the toy and the words and the gestures. It's a mainly male dance, and it's an aggressive dance. Hit, 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 etc., etc. And Mandela, when he joined a toy-toying group, did it in a very, very different way, the so-called Madiba shuffle, inclusive, smiling, all these things. He really transformed the nature of that dance in the context of building an inclusive society. Grasa Michelle, I don't agree completely with all this, I think about forgiveness and all this, because when I was involved I was in the leadership with Mandela, and I didn't hear a lot of talk about forgiveness and all of this and reconciliation. I think it wasn't so big a thing, so much as single-mindedness. Nevertheless, she says, when he came out, he knew exactly what he wanted to do and what he wanted to be. And he symbolized a much broader, she says, a much broader forgiveness and understanding. He was reaching out. He was wanting to assure whites and other minority sections of the population they had nothing to fear from majority rule. At the same time, in this period, some of what had been part of his private self came out in his love of children, which is not like the typical politician patting children on the head. He obviously loved them unqualifiedly. And as I've said, the angry Mandela of the earlier days did not simply disappear. When de Klerk did something at Codestria, Mandela was not, de Klerk thought he's the last speaker, but Mandela got up and was very angry. He said, even from the leader of an illegitimate, immoral regime, we expect some integrity. And, he really went for de Klerk. And that is something that is characteristic of the history, not just of Mandela, but of the ANC as well, that we have a situation of ruptures, but also continuities. Mandela's life represented both ruptures with what he had been, attempts to be a better human being or a different human being, but also some signs that the Mandela of his youth was still alive in part of his consciousness. So what I've tried to do in this input is not to succumb to the idea. I didn't agree with negotiations, by the way, because I had been involved in insurrection, so I was, like many others, taken by surprise. But I've come in subsequently to admire what Mandela did and to agree with the notion of a negotiated settlement, because the people who were dying were the oppressed, not the rich whites or the apartheid regime. I've come to agree with that, but I've also come to understand the complexity of Mandela. I'm not insisting that you accept my interpretation, but what I do insist on is that you accept the complexity of Mandela as a human being and Mandela's leadership, and that if you, in so doing, make errors like I have done, you must admit them frankly. That's what scholarship is about. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Satna. 2 points that emerge. One is to think about Mandela's, the allegation around Mandela abusing his wife, and this relationship between 2 men, himself and Sithole, and how that formed him. And another one, which I think we'll think about just as I invite the next speaker, is this issue of how do South African men become men in a country that makes boys of them for life? So with that, I just realized I did not introduce Ellen Zinn. Ellen, if you can switch on your camera just quickly to say hello, who is the director of CANRAD, and one of the veterans who is still with us in our institutions, enabling a generational transfer to happen in Nelson Mandela University. So hello, Ellen. Let me invite Ms. Kamanoveve to the platform to do a response and discuss her views on the paper and the broader issues around masculinity over the generations. Kama is a research assistant at the Chair for Critical Studies in Higher Education and Transformation, also known as CRISHET, and also is a research assistant with the Center for Women and Gender Studies. She is a PhD candidate, and her research interests include, but are not limited to, race, gender, migration studies, critical pedagogy, citizenship, and human rights. Please welcome Ms. Noveve.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank CANRAD and the Department of History and Political Studies for this opportunity to share my own interpretations and ideas on the work of Prof. Satna. So I'd like to depart on the fact that the global hierarchies that we see today are actually a legacy of that started in 1492, involving the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, of which he called the coloniality of power, which is a system of modernity. At the core of Quijano's argument and articulation of coloniality of power is the idea that racial superiority of Euro-Americans was constituted during this period, and most importantly, that their dominance over other groups whom they racialized was deemed to be natural. It was this global imposition and Eurocentric patterns of organizing knowledge that a well-known African author, Oyewumi Oyeronke's book, The Invention of Woman, Making an African Sense of Western Gender Discourses Challenged. In that volume, she exposed gender as a colonial category, calling into question the idea that gender categories are natural, universal, and inherently the way in which humans organized themselves and thought about themselves. Gender then is a category that is central to the construction and organization of knowledge in our time, at least. So I'm going to argue that if gender is socially constructed, then there must have been a time that it was not. So therefore, the constitution of gender as a social category is actually a product of culture, which is space, and it must also be recognized as a product of history, which is time. In much of the African continent, provincializing the West is actually an epic struggle, because given the erasure of African cosmologies, the demonization of indigenous religions and knowledge systems, and the destruction of African institutions, othering of persons, and epistemicide that resulted from colonial conquest, there are assumptions that attempts at decolonization of the body, space, and the minds have little impact, because Africans have little knowledge or misunderstand the phenomenon itself, of which Sabelo Ndlovu Kajeni says is not true, because with regards to knowledge production and gender in Africa, he describes this imposition of knowledge system as a colonial matrix of power that reproduces Western ideational domination on the African continent. So, young Mandela, as a boy, grows up in rural Eastern Cape, is born in rural Eastern Cape in Qunu, and he is socialized to play stick fighting and all the other combative games that would represent war or some form of defense, like games like Utindi, of which Prof. Satna already mentioned in his reading. And throughout his life, Mandela is a young boy, Mandela going to live with King Dalingebo up until he became a statesman. The term that is developed by Raymond Colonial of hegemonic masculinities is very important here, because we see Mandela going through all these phases and becoming at some point one of these hegemonic masculinities. In one of the first applications of this term or concept in the South African context, Robert Morrell used the term to describe the dynamics of masculinity as well as male power. So there were three. So there's the white masculinity, which was represented in the political and the economic domain. And then there was the African rurally based masculinity, which perpetuates masculinity. Black masculinity that had emerged in the context of organization. Guys, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
I think we're having, I'm just checking to see. I think you may have a network problem there. Can you?
Yeah, because it kicked me out and then I'm back again.
All right. I think, go ahead. I think you're back. Are you able to come? We did get a note from ICT that there are some network issues across the Mandela system. Let me just quickly check what exactly it's saying. So it's actually a universal issue right now across the Zoom platform. Kama, can you pick up again?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. So I picked out just a few points in Professor Satner's work, but of significance here is the stick fighting and the games of socialization that Mandela was exposed to as a little boy. I read quite a lot about what stick fighting meant to young boys and the in the rural areas in parts of South Africa. And I draw on the work of John Ifa's sweeping survey of honor, which was an ideological motivation guiding African men to the ranks of heroes. So heroic honor and a combination of patience, wisdom, sobriety, and kinship were values that were instilled in Mandela at a very young age, which we see are actually positive masculinities, positive African masculinities. Also, Ndukwana Mbengwana, an oral historian in 1903, pointed out the importance of being given a stick as a herdman or a boy that is herding cattle. It means that the stick represents you protecting your lineage, protecting your resources. It's associated also with honor and some form of martial art and household honor that should be sustained. So I believe that in itself shows that it does not necessarily mean that because stick fighting was a martial art to others, but to others it also instilled good values, positive values of masculinity. But whether stick fighting is understood in political terms or gender relationships or a combination of these and other power dimensions, we should challenge the assumption that it is invariably a stoked aggressive masculinity and the cause of violent criminality in South Africa. So Mandela moves away from his mother and is under the tutelage of King Dalindyebo. We see here a central theme that I actually took some time to think about the role and the definitions of family throughout time. Mandela's father passed away at a very young age. He moves away from his mother. He grows up under King Dalindyebo. He, again, himself doesn't spend much time with his own family, with his first wife, Evelyn Mase, of which she used to stay with Mandela's mother and the children. And then later on, he goes to prison and leaves Winnie to raise 2 kids by herself. So we see that he never really grew up in your so-called nuclear family. And much historical evidence to illustrate the impact of apartheid is informed by the normative Western nuclear family. And even today, in many psychological studies, they say that single parenthood is fathers, especially their children's life, are not real masculinity. So when in Africa, actually, it was never really the dominant way of doing family. The whole nuclear family idea, because it was, again, a Western imposition. There is an irony because Mandela he was then later on called the father of the nation. I don't know whether that's paradox or irony, but it's just an idea that I'm thinking about. But I'd like to also delve into the fact that in history, there's evidence and record that challenges the current negative constructions of fathers and how African men of Phyllis Ndandala and her father, Desmond Tutu's daughter, Thandeka Tutu Xashe, and Ezekiel Mphahlele. There's many of them. So I'd like us to really think about the term of fatherhood and what it really means. Is it really necessary to have a mother, which is a female, and a father in the same household for children to be able to have a supportive and healthy life? Because we see that that's not the case in the life of Mandela, because he became a statesman. So, and actually a great example of masculinity. But on my second last point is the fact that when Mandela was a young boy, he underwent the rite of passage of amaXhosa, which is male circumcision. There's been many debates in our country of whether we have lost our way with regards to that rite of passage and cultural tradition. But the question I ask is, what makes a man who he is in his culture? Because the significance of this question is that it allows exploration for the multiple meanings and new angles of studying and thinking about masculinity. In cases where people that are initiated, that go through that rite of passage, for example, are engaged in violent and criminal acts or are disrespectful, the fact remains is that they do not lose their status as indoda. The social fact of have undergone ulwaluko and having a manhood status among amaXhosa is grounded primarily in the physical body. So not only does the penis serve as a site for symbolic location of manhood status, it is a medium through which men can validate and defend their manhood status in times of need. This is illustrated by the work of Zakes Mda in The Heart of Redness, a book that he published in 2000. So bodies in contemporary masculinity theory are no longer treated as mere cultural constructions and passive outcomes of discourse. So let me just quickly move on because I'm running out of time. So Mandela, as a statesman and as a president of the ANC, we see him presenting a new masculinity. He was, well, very different and challenged much of the violent and authoritarian behaviors and attitudes associated with apartheid's white male politicians. But then again, his successors didn't really develop that ideal of the new masculinity, because Thabo Mbeki was more of a president that was viewed, or in the perception of people, that he was aloof and he was dictatorial and a bully. And this did not make it easy, because he had some resistance to the program of gender equality. And then again in 2009, we have Jacob Zuma in the highest seat of office in this country. And we all know that he represented a total different type of masculinity. But let me note that most people in South Africa, he was very popular, and it would seem that most South Africans do approve, and it is the masculinity that they understand and own as theirs. But just to wrap up, we can see in the life of Mandela, and even in contemporary times, the various historical accounts of how masculinity has evolved, and the various and the fact that there are many hegemonic masculinities, there's not just one. So one of the shortcomings of the appropriation of fixed understanding of hegemonic masculinity by many gender activists is a reproduction of a moralistic binary, which links hegemony with bad men and stigmatizes African male behavior and attitude as hegemonic. So we can see in South Africa in gender politics that there's evidence that there are shifts towards gender equality, in the constructions of masculinity, but this was most noticeable in the presidency of Nelson Mandela, who explicitly embraced the more gender equitable masculinity. Thank you.
Thank you, Kama. As usual, reading against the grain, not just in terms of the conceptions of gender, but you're also critiquing those who say they are critiquing gender as well. You see, and I think that's a very important engagement, Raymond, with your reading of Mandela, understanding, as Kama is saying, look, this is what manhood means in this context, and it can't just be lumped with someone else's conception of what does hegemonic masculinity mean in society. I really thought that was an interesting intervention there, which is interesting again because if kwaXhosa you can never be dispossessed of your manhood, what happens in a world where you are actually economically dispossessed of your manhood? Does it actually help to serve as a way of still affirming your manhood, even though this white system takes your manhood away? And in that sense, I'd be so interested in how people of the Eastern Cape understand Mandela's masculinity and Sithole as a mentor of a man, and maybe in fact Mandela's militancy comes from the fact that he's so sure about uyindoda. This thing that happens yamabhunu becomes a matter of fighting warriorship for him. So ubudoda bakhe and the struggle sakhe cannot be delinked. Reminding me of the way in which Xolela Mancu must come to terms with Steve Biko as a drunken brawler. Yeah. So these militant men and their humanity, you know, and Xolela Mancu has to come to terms with that. Okay, Steve Biko better. So what does that mean? And what kind of personhood is he embracing through his cultural masculinity as he attends militantly, both Biko and Mandela and their times, to Amapun? Okay, I believe it's question time. And I would like to note again that we are having network problems that are somehow affecting the system as a whole. So if you see people being kicked in and out, others couldn't join, there's some kind of an issue happening. So I open, just raise your hand. I am supposed to check here on my phone if there are questions. If somebody is watching the chat screen. Do we have a chat screen? Chat. Aha, there we go. Dombo Vuyo Linda, what I liked about this article. Dombo Vuyo, would you like to make your comment, switch on your mic and your video to make the comment? Or do you want me to read this for you? I'll read it so long I can't see. You can switch on your mic. What I liked about this article is how it challenges the idea of masculinity as being static and fixed function. So in a way, it explores the categorizations of men's own experiences into various masculinity models. Kama, I like the input you made about positive masculinities, and I'd like you to perhaps to expand on that by way of definition. For discussion's sake, what does or can positive masculinity look and feel like? How is it identified? And does this inform an expression of new ways of manhood? Not forgetting that manhood itself can be varied. Raymond, what I'll do is I'll give you a 2 minute, just so you can respond to anything Kama raised, while I give people the chance. Kama, just take note of that comment as well. So while I give people to digest what has been discussed, and it doesn't have to do with, you don't have to ask questions directly to the paper. If there's other questions that are emerging that don't seem to fit in the box around this topic, please feel free to ask. Raymond, just unmute your microphone and
yeah.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, I was very impressed with Kama's input, the epistemological part, and also the problematizing of a lot of the things that I raised. What I think, one of the questions that to me is troubling and difficult to answer is if Mandela was an example of a positive version of masculinity, but it was more or less repudiated by a later leader. And as she says, very many people approved of the type of masculinity that Jacob Zuma represented. How do we ensure, if we do identify what is the positive version, desirable version of masculinity, how do we ensure that that is not only inculcated, but it stays part of people's life? Now, I don't myself have the answers beyond saying that we haven't yet erected norms that are widely accepted. Like violence is not considered wrong in South Africa. If someone looks at you, if you look at someone absent-mindedly, they may give you a clap because, you know, that's the way South Africans tend to behave. So I don't have, I'm very appreciative of the trouble that Karma took, and I didn't catch the name of the last speaker properly, but I thought that she was taking it further by saying that we have to identify. How do we identify positive masculinity? I'm saying if you identify it, how do you ensure that it's sustainable? Thank you.
Can I just ask a question, since this is Ingoko? How do you understand O.R. Tambo as a man? I'll bring you in just now, Kama, and I see Nikita has a hand up. Prof. Satna, can you talk a little bit about Oliver Tambo? Because I find that a lot of people found that he formed, with his sort of Christian Africanism, he formed a model of masculinity that was very anchoring for many people in the struggle. Can you speak, can you compare with that?
Yes, you know, I didn't work a lot with Oliver Tambo. I met him in the 80s briefly, and then he had his stroke. So I was not able to engage with him as vigorously as I was with Mandela and Sithole and others. However, I do believe that he was exemplary in his conduct, and that it was under his leadership that the ANC made very important statements on gender in the 1980s. And I think that his modesty, his lack of, his gentleness, his lack of aggression was part of, we have to take some of these qualities that are not peculiar to men and build them into our models of masculinity. So what I know of Oliver Tambo is not as substantial by virtue of not having been in exile. You know, I did meet him when I was out of the country a couple of times, but I didn't work such a lot with him. But I think he was a very important example, and those of the people who worked with him will testify to that.
Kama, would you like to respond to the question around, comment around positive masculinities?
Yes. Well, I'm just throwing my opinion in there. You know, I believe that if there should be a certain construction of or elements of positive masculinity, then it would mean qualities that don't do harm to others or that do not subordinate other human beings. Because masculinity, or what they say toxic masculinity is the subordination of women. But we're not talking about that now. We're talking about masculinities, and in actual fact, through history and through time, we have seen that masculinities are hierarchical in themselves. Because let me just make, it's quite an old example, but it's relevant anyway. There is an ordained minister who was the first Black South African to study abroad. His name is Dio Soka. He was a Christian man. He was married. He had 5 children. He was a heterosexual man. Those are probably the qualities of the common masculinity that we see today, what makes a man a man. But then Diyosoka was a Xhosa man, but he was not circumcised. The question is, does that make Diyosoka not a man? Another example is Zakes Mda. He is a famous author in South Africa. He went to exile when he was 16 years old. He got medically circumcised in Lesotho, but when he came back to the Eastern Cape, they performed a ceremony for him called Ukuyalwa, meaning that it's the elders that get together and give the initiate advice on how to be a man and what a man does. But does that mean, I mean, Zakes Mda has a wife and 5 kids. So does that mean that Zakes Mda is not a man? So those, I think, are things that we need to think about, and it ties back to the concept of these hegemonic masculinities. Does that mean that he's not a man? That's the question I put to the audience.
So I noted there was a space opened up in Mandela Ubhlanti or something. I think I think we must open up that space more again.
Yes.
I'll come back to that. Nikita. So I think Nikita has a question. So, mute. Nikita, there's a problem with your sound. Okay, Nikita, can you put your, Nikita, please put your question with chat, and then we will try and connect again to you. Raymond, having said this, I think there is a real discussion that needs to be had. You see, again, I raised the issue. Mandela had to contend with the idea that while he was going through ritual initiation, the world in which he was going to live, he was going to be basically a perpetual boy. This is a very important contradiction, I think, that needs to be dealt with today around how we're going to talk about positive masculinity, but in a world in which Black men generally do not find stable labor, and worse so as late capitalism unfolds. So that's a question that I want you to try and help us think through. The other is, I hardly hear about Mandela as a partner and as a lover. He seemed to have a lot of women in his life. What can you tell us about that? We want to know that thing as well, because I think his handsomeness, a very good looking Xhosa man, very good looking Mthembu there, and I think his swag and his ability to be that kind of man had a way in his own spaces. So I'm challenging you to talk about Mandela and his and the women.
I just want to say on this question of emasculation, you refer to unemployment. Then the question which Kama raised is, if you've not been circumcised, are you a man? And we need to remember that Zulu people have not carried out circumcision. The Amampondo at various stages have also not done so. So I think it's very important that we do not fixate on any one element as constituting manhood. And that one of the reasons why I said that what was important is not just whether someone went through the process of circumcision, but what were the teachings that went along with it? How was masculinity constructed? Can't be constructed through a medical procedure. It's constructed through a whole lot of other things. And you're referring to the fact that if someone is unemployed, their self-worth as a man and as a human being is undermined. So we've got to ask ourselves, we've got to de-link masculinity from a trial of strength. whether in circumcision, stick fighting, or any other limited element. You're putting me on the spot on Mandela's lovers. I don't know such a lot. I've heard that someone or other's child was Mandela's, and I don't think I want to be the person who, let me put it this way, I do think Mandela himself admits, you know, there's a story that I heard that someone claimed that she was the child of Mandela, and his aides all denied this. And Mandela looked at it and he said, well, it could be, you know, and I think he admitted that as a young man, he did have a lot of lovers, and it is said that he had relations with Lillian Ngoyi, Ruth Mpati, and a number of others. I'm not, I don't really want, if I've been told something confidentially, I don't really want to, you know, break that confidence. I've not been told by Mandela, but I mean, I've been told that someone or other is the son or daughter of Mandela, in fact, and that would point to a number of different relationships that he had. But I'm not very acquainted with it. You know, now I've heard a lot of different things, but I really think let someone else be the one who addresses your curiosity in that regard. All I will say is that Mandela himself admits that he had a wandering eye, and that wandering eye was often consummated in relationships that led to children outside of marriage.
Thank you. I defend asking that question because the relationship between sex and political spaces in South Africa is something that is constantly navigated. And the way in which men have sex in those spaces is not the way that women can have sex in those spaces. I think also the relationship between becoming a man and being a political figure in South Africa. And we see today with the way in which women in political spaces find themselves as points of almost being consumed by the dominant male players in their political spaces is incredibly important to unpack, especially for young people, to understand that these are not places of rhetoric. These are places where sex is happening, and the way in which men behave as sexual beings in those spaces has to come under quite a bit of a discussion. If we are also going to talk about enabling politics to be safe for women in the country. Novella, please, sorry, Raymond, I'll let you just, Novella, unmute, and then when Raymond has responded, can you just make your point?
Yeah, I'm not.
Thanks, Raymond, yes?
I'm not criticizing your question. I think I answered it inadequately because you're quite correct.
Fine, yeah.
That the power of the male, like if it's true that Mandela had a relationship with Ruth Mpati, she was a secretary in the Tambo and Mandela firm. So it wasn't an equal power relationship. And I thought you wanted me to give revelations, and you were not. You were actually asking me to, you're wanting me to speak to the power, which...
No, well, it's power and desire. It, you know, for many of us, I mean, growing up in homes like this, sex was a part of politics and making relationships that were political. Sure. Nobubele, please, can you switch on your mic and your video and make your comment?
I'm just not going to switch on my video purely because my data, I think it's called bandwidth. Yes, it's very low. But I'm wanting to ask Ukama and perhaps Prof Satna as well will then feed into this curiosity about how overburdened the legacy of Mandela is, and whether or not we still need to lean on just him when we're trying to find these alternative masculinities as shining examples for South Africa. Is it necessary for us to still center Mandela, Or is it possible for us to look around Mandela, the discussion on his lovers as well, the discussion on his mentors, to then find alternatives to masculinity and the influences of his masculinity, rather than focusing on just him?
Kama? I see you, Prof. Njongwana. I'll call you just now.
Yes, indeed. Nobubele makes a very good point. Also, at some point, I sometimes feel like we really, your Mandela, a lot of people have written about him and in such subjects. And I do feel, yes, there is another alternative masculinity other than Mandela's one, especially when Nobu makes the point about the people that were around him, his advisors, Abba Walter and Oliver Tambo. So it's not, no, I don't think it's necessary. I don't really have much knowledge about Oliver and Walter rather than basic knowledge, but it's not necessary to lean onto these qualities. There might be others of positive masculinity, especially in the African context.
Raymond, yes?
When I come to deal with Luthuli is a very different type of masculine figure. In some ways, I think he is a very neglected male leader who needs to be looked at. But Walter Sisulu I would endorse very much, and Oliver Tambo from what I know.
Professor Njongwana, please switch on your mic and your video so you can make your comment. And then I will read the outstanding comments and we will wrap up.
Thank you. Sorry, my bandwidth is not okay today, so I won't switch on the video. My first quick comment is just a thought that such a discussion evokes, that how do we reclaim in practice and synthesize all these positive African values, such as positive masculinities, into our society, and not sort of have that, yes, there's the engagement pillar in academia, but it's just a thought, and also how, and it puts a spotlight on social citizenship theory, for example, how we really as Africans need to expand on that and integrate gender and historical perspectives, which may then in turn inform policies, which will go some way into developing a society, well, quote unquote, developing society towards reclaiming those positive values. But just a direct a question for Raymond, please, about your thoughts on how countries that have necessarily gained their liberation or freedom through violent means, how that sort of gets translated or continues into life after liberation, or societies after liberation, how the link between those two. There's a book that problematizes that, for example, called From Guerrilla to Government. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I just wondered what your thoughts on that are, that, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, hold on to that question, Prof. I'm going to take one last question, Barry, because I want us to wrap up. I'm going to read what's on the side there, and then we wrap up. We've only got about 2-3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Prof. Satna, Professor Mkhize. I want to pick up on the point that you made in your previous comment, Nomalanga, where you raised the issue of people of the Eastern Cape. Do they appreciate the particular history and context of the Eastern Cape historically? And as Raymond was speaking and Kama gave a response, I couldn't help but think of and when you have a nuanced reading of the history of the Eastern Cape and the violence inflicted, particularly the violence inflicted on families by the colonial regime, earlier maybe with the Batavian Republic and subsequent, what impact that might have had on the formation of this warrior culture that you referred to, particularly in the Eastern Cape, as it moves, for example, from the Gamtus through the Sundays and further east past the Fish and onward. So for me, the question that I want to ask comes back to Kama's point, maybe just a few comments on that history, that particularly violent history, and the impact of not just the African masculinity, but that convergence. Because if you read that history and you have a nuanced reading of those who actually governed the Cape at the time, all of them actually, whether they came from India with a very strong military, they were actually military men. Somerset, the worst, I think, Craddock, and all of them were actually imperial soldiers. And if you read the correspondence maybe between the Home Office or their bosses in London, you'd actually, it's actually not surprising that early formation, that early conquest was actually very violent. And I don't know whether people in the Eastern Cape in particular have an appreciation of how that process was not just violent, but it laid the basis for a kind of an infantilized male, almost actually black bodies were just infantilized. I mean, if you look at the work, your own work, Nomalanga, on how people in the Karoo, for example, were post-proclamation 48, 49, and 50. And how post that, and even the whole question of abolition actually coming to the fore in terms of the Black Lives Matter and the reparations question, that the abolitionist moment here in South Africa in 1808, 1807, for example, was not actually a liberatory moment. We know that the fact that Europeans and British subjects, the white subjects of the British colony could still claim, slave owners could still claim and was still being paid for the damages incurred as a result of the abolition up as late as 2015. So that violence is very deep, and there's a need, I think, an appreciation for having a more nuanced reading of this. And then the impact of that, even on last point, even on this gang culture and how the number culture, for example, you see there's a resistance, but at the same time, there's a, you know, if you take the context of the 28, etc., and this notion, very embedded masculinity that is highly complex. So, yeah. Prof, maybe you can share us a little bit just about how we need to approach this question, how we can, responding to your own point that you made earlier. Thanks.
Okay, Raymond, just hang on. I will just wrap up with the comments that have been written here, and then I will ask Kama for a 1-minute summation, and then your closing of the program. Barry's question is very important. Again, you have to, and Pagama's point as well, Prof. Njongwana, historicizing violence in this country is extremely important. We talk about warriorhood and manhood, but if you were not a warrior, how on earth were you going to be David Stearman resisting the Boers, penetrating into Graafrenet, taking your land? The Khoi and San warrior resistance that was 150 years. We cannot merely sit in the academy now in the nice post-apartheid, you know. Even you, Raymond, you told us, good, you were not going to hear from the Boers. You didn't want Mandela to negotiate. So the history needs to be really understood within context. And Kama, this point you were making, let me just read here. Olwami Mngwazi says, there's a difference between indoda ngumXhosa and indoda yomXhosa. Soka and da amen. One can be a man in various ways. indoda engumXhosa might just be translated as a Xhosa male, but indoda yomXhosa is basically a boy that became a man by going through the Xhosa manhood initiation ritual. Yabona siya revitalize apha nge-concepts enkosi. Similarly, we have umakoti in Xhosa and a bride in English. You only become umakoti when you have followed the Xhosa way of bringing a young lady into a family. So you can be a self-acclaimed makoti, but it might not mean that you were given a name and maybe fed utsiki as well in the clans that do that. Strong intervention there. Nikita, you want to try last time to say your point? I'm sorry, your sound was so bad. Okay, Nikita, switch it off. We cannot hear you at all. You sound like AM wave radio of Akali. Okay. Kama, can you please make your final concluding comments, and then Raymond, you, thanks. And I will ask Ellen to just be on standby to say thank you to everybody.
Okay, one last comment. There's a lady that asked about what we can do to be able to promote or have more of these positive masculinities. But the fact is that we need to go back and be honest with ourselves that this binaristic and essentialistic ideas of gender, we need to do away with it. It's going to be difficult because it's hundreds and hundreds of years of colonial imposition, but we need to be honest to ourselves that that is not African, because Africa and Africans, they're usually related to each other in terms of kinship, most importantly. So this gender and essentialist binaristic thinking, we need to do away with it. But it's very difficult to do that when a child is socialized. By the time that they even start talking, they are dressed like a boy or girl. Then the education system also does its own galvanizing of those ideas. And as an adult, that's the only thing that you know. So I think it's time that we go back into history and to our roots. And that's when we can actually do something about or do something positive or progress in terms of the decolonization project. Thanks.
Thank you. Raymond, your final comments, just attending to some of the issues raised.
Yes. I agree with the general thrust of Karma that we have to look at history, but not in an essentialized way. When we retrieve things from the past, we have to understand that we are talking about dynamic societies where there was not one meaning to culture, custom, and number of things. The question that Professor Nchongwana raised about national liberation movements who use armed struggle and what effect that has on the continuation of violence afterwards. We have the situation in South Africa where in 2011 was the anniversary of MK's formation, which got attention right through the year. It was also the same 50th anniversary of Luthuli getting the Nobel Prize and was hardly mentioned. Now, what I think has happened in South Africa is that I think we correctly valorize the heroism of some of the people who as young boys and young girls gave up their youth to go and fight to liberate this country. But we have to understand that there's a time for war and there's a time for peace. And unfortunately, we haven't, and national liberation movements tend generally to continue the armed struggle type of rhetoric after the time. It was correct to have some songs about hitting and killing people during the struggle, but it's not correct in a time of peace. And we've got to learn how to build the notion of non-violence as an attractive principle, not just for sissies. Barry's point about the Eastern Cape warrior tradition, I think it was both dehumanizing, but as I think he said, the way of escaping from the dehumanization was by taking up arms against the conquerors. And I think, again, that brings us to what we've learned is the way of solving problems in South African history has been, and also in society. They listen, whether we like the EFF or not, which I don't agree with what they did. But when the EFF did their ruffian stuff in cliques went and talked to them. The government didn't intervene to deal with the issue. So we've learned ways in South Africa which are historical as well as contemporary. I agree very much with, I think, Karma's point that there are a number of different ways of becoming a man, being a man. You know that on Robben Island, there was an Nslebi there who a lot of them said they want to be initiated. They did it there, also one of the warders as well. But so it can be done in a number of different ways, and you can become a man through a number of processes. What we've got to start doing is communicate what are the valuable qualities that we want men to be. And I think what we learn from the giants, Chris Hani, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela, is a combination of toughness as well as gentleness and caring. And I think we really have to break with the idea that the only way of solving problems is through force.
Thank you, Ellen. You can so long switch on. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Ellen, would you like me to announce the coming seminar?
Yes, please.
Or would you like to do that?
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the next seminar, it's on, when is it? 23 September. It will be Prof. Satna engaging Pedro Mzileni. And the topic is Africanization, African identities and emancipation in contemporary South Africa. So please join on the 23rd for this engagement with Pedro. And I think you can see already the feel and the mood. We are here to really probe and work through some tricky issues. Ellen, can you please say thank you and release us?
It's a real pleasure. It's been a great start, to the series Nomalanga, and so glad that we were able to pull everything together. Raymond and Kama, thank you so much for the lively debate that we've been having. I do want to invite, because we are learning via this sort of technology, that the people who are on the Facebook and the YouTube, if you don't come into the Zoom, you are also able to come and put your questions into the chat, sort of spaces. We were quite worried about the numbers that would be available on the Zoom, but now that we see that there's an overflow space, I think I'm going to ask you to invite people in for next Wednesday, and so that we can really take this this further. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending and for your questions. It was great.
Thank you all. See you at the next discussion.